In March of 1989, he was elected House Republican Whip, the second highest Republican leadership post in the House of Representatives. He is the Dean of the Georgia House delegation. Congressman Gingrich is a student and admirer of Dr. Deming, having carved out several days from his busy schedule the last few years to personally meet and learn from Dr. Deming. His closest advisor, his wife Marianne, has also attended a Deming 4-day seminar. Congressman Gingrich firmly believes that Deming's system of profound knowledge is fundamental to the future of this country. He has personally developed an accredited course to present a workable and practical blueprint for renewing American civilization by employing 5 principles or pillars, one of which being the system of profound knowledge. Several universities, including the University of California, Clemson University, and Penn State University, have adopted this course for credit, and the class is also available on videotape and is broadcast via satellite weekly on National Empowerment Television. Newt, the son of a career soldier, received his bachelor's degree from Emory University and his doctorate in modern European history from Tulane University. He taught history and environmental studies at West Georgia College for 8 years before being elected to Congress in 1978. He is also the co-author of the book, Window of Opportunity. Congressman Gingrich states that there is a distinct American culture that has flourished for over 200 years, and yet today is in jeopardy. Renewal of this civilization requires identifying and fostering the underlying values and attitudes that enable free markets, private enterprise, and democratic system to function and flourish. Ladies and gentlemen, speaking on Deming's system of profound knowledge being fundamental to this renewal of American civilization, Congressman Newt Gingrich.
Thank you. I appreciate very much the chance to be here. As most of you know, as an elected official, most of my life is made up either of TV sound bites, speeches on the floor of the House, or occasionally going to a Rotary Club or someplace where you give a 20-minute talk. And you can imagine then my confusion when I showed up here and they have all sorts of electrical paraphernalia, so I could actually go back to being a professor. But since my handwriting is terrible, and frankly I was a history professor, and so I'm not sure I could do much of this anyway, I'm sort of a little confused about what to do. What I would like to try to do in the next few minutes is share with you where I think we're at and the challenge that lies ahead of us in the broadest sense. And then just toss it open to questions, comments, or whatever for as much time as possible. So I'm not going to try to give you an elaborate, fancy speech. I'm instead going to just share with you a story about a journey that Marianne and I have been on, and where, as a leader at the national level, I think we're at and what we're trying to do about it, and then just see what ideas you have. I accepted coming out here, and to give you some example of my schedule, I'm here, then I go to Akron, then I go over to Indianapolis, then I go down to Louisville, then I end this evening in New York City. So, I mean, I had a lot of alternatives to coming and speaking to this group. But I really felt when Barbara Lawton first approached me about this, that what you're doing is potentially so important that I really wanted to come and share with you and see to what extent we can work together and to what extent we can create a joint effort in the direction we want to go in. Now, let me start and say that I operate off of a very long-range approach to things. I really believe that you have to think in very long sweeps in order to have some sense of where society is going. That's not the way the daily newspaper operates or the every half-hour CNN headline news, but I think that's the way civilization operates. And so I think that it's useful to take a long view, and frankly, having met Dr. Deming in his late 80s and known him for a few years, he obviously had lived a long view and was able in that sense to seeing things change over a long period of time in a way that was very helpful. Now what I'm going to do is give you some examples of how to think strategically that we're using, tell you about a couple of projects we're engaged in, and then talk briefly about Dr. Deming's contribution and how we ought to, in my judgment, ought to think about the near future. Let me say, first of all, that I use a very particular planning model that I want to encourage you to consider using. It's very simple in structure. It's only 4 words. But it's a hierarchy, and I think it will help you as you develop complex problems or complex opportunities. The top level is vision. What's your vision of what you're trying to accomplish? And it's very important to spend the time really carefully writing that out. And I want to suggest to you, as we talk about the future, and this may be controversial, but I figure I'm just here as an outsider and as an elected official, and most of you probably wonder why I'm here anyway, so I can afford to just say what I think and not worry about what it leads to. I really believe you need to think about profound knowledge more than you think about Deming. I mean, Einstein figured out the core understanding which led to the future of all physics, but other people developed many of the specific details. You can't understand modern physics just by rereading Einstein's works. And I would say similarly that while Deming codified a profound insight and created a system of thought that is very powerful, I don't think he would want to be an icon in the long run. He is the beginning, he's not the culmination. And so I would hope you'd think about focusing on profound knowledge at the vision level. Secondly, I'm going to argue that ultimately we want to democratize profound knowledge so it becomes as obvious and as normal as learning how to read or learning how to use a laptop or learning how to do math. In fact, more normal than those 3 are in some places in America today. But that in fact we ought to ask ourselves, what are the underlying lessons for humans and patterns for humans that come out of profound knowledge that ought to be part of American civilization and not just something a consultant does or something business does or something we apply in the workplace. So start with vision. The second layer is strategies. Once you have figured out where you're trying to go, what are your strategies for getting there? And again, it's a sequence. You don't want to start working on strategies till you've thought through your vision fairly clearly. Once you have your vision and strategies thought through, the third layer is projects. And a project, this is an entrepreneurial, not a bureaucratic model, a project is a definable, delegatable achievement. Lastly, what do you do tactically? What are your tactics? So what do you do every day? And I find, and in talking with Dr. Deming, I was often struck that it was easy to nod yes to what he was saying until you then went back and checked what you were doing. And actually getting what you're doing to be congruent with what he was saying was a lot harder than you thought. At least that was my limited experience. Now in that framework, I just want to suggest to you that if you keep in mind in the back of your head a model of vision, strategies, projects, and tactics, and you ask yourself over and over, what are you engaged in doing and why are you doing it? It's the primary difference between measuring progress and measuring activity. And all too often, this is a society which focuses on activity. We're a country where people like to get in the car, start to drive, and then take the map out. And I'm suggesting that actually trying to figure out where the map is a helpful starting point. Now, in many ways, vision, strategies, projects, and tactics is an internalized model of thought. But I want to now, for leadership purposes, suggest a second set of 4 words that are a process that are frankly one of the places where I think Dr. Deming tended to fall down. And that is what I believe is the essence of Toffler's third wave model of the information revolution. Leadership in the 21st century will not be an individual simply pointing in a direction. Leadership will always involve a leader team because virtually everything that has to be done is too complex for a single person to do it very well. And I would suggest the following 4 words as a process. They're not a hierarchy, they're just a sequence in which you ought to take them up. And they're very simple. Listen, learn, help, and lead. I would suggest to you that the first thing you want to do is listen to somebody else before you start telling them. When you listen to them, you should genuinely learn. I'm not talking here about transactional listening where your eyes glaze over and you sort of wait for the idiot to get done so you can tell them something smart. I'm talking about genuinely trying to figure out what are they saying and why are they saying it. If you listen and learn, you can almost always help people, either because you have a unique perspective, because you have information they don't have, or just because the act of telling somebody made them feel better. The process of, or because you can bring unique resources to the table. If you listen and learn and help in a rational society, people want you to be a leader. Which is why I think that the sequence is listen, learn, help, and lead. And I tell senior military people, if you aren't surrounded by good enough staff that you listen to every morning, you better get a new staff. I would say that to anybody in this room who has, if you're not listening first, you ought to ask yourself, why do you think you know what's going on? Now, if you apply listen, learn, help, and lead as the implementation phase, of which vision, strategies, projects, and tactics is the planning phase and the analytical phase, let me take you up to the vision level for our civilization and suggest to you that there are 4 large facts that will define the rest of your life, and that to the degree that we don't cope with these facts at the vision level, that they are in fact causing us an enormous difficulty. The first fact is that we are in the early stages of Alvin Toffler's third wave. He describes in the book by that name a process of change which involves a transition comparable to the first wave, which was the shift from hunting, gathering to agriculture, and then the concept of the second wave, which was the shift from agriculture to industry. And he argues that the third wave is the shift from industry to information. Now, people all say that, and they nod yes, they think that means that clearly they're going along with it, because after all, they know that's true. Go back sometime and look at how big the change is from hunting, gathering to agriculture. The rise of Rome, Babylon, Egypt, Han, China, Incas, Aztecs, versus the world of hunting, gathering before them. Or look at the radical change from the age of agriculture to industry. George Washington in 1790 could talk more easily with Julius Caesar, 1800 years earlier, than he could talk with Norman Schwarzkopf about Desert Storm, or even talk with Dwight Eisenhower about Normandy. The scale of change between Washington and 1900 was larger than the scale of change between Caesar and Washington. And it was a wrenching, painful, and disorienting change. Read Dickens' novels about Bleak House would be a good example. One way to think about this is to look at a magnificent book by Huizinga called The Waning of the Middle Ages, in which he pointed out that for medieval Christianity, the Renaissance was not the birth of the new, it was the death of the old, and it was terrifying. And so we are going through a period of transition, and we frankly are very early in that period. We're not in the middle of it. We're about where airplanes were in 1908. We really have an enormous scale of change coming, and it will permeate our entire civilization. The second big fact we're faced with is the rise of a genuine world market. This is not about GATT or NAFTA or any of those things. It is an objective fact that the value of money is established worldwide by a flow of capital instantaneously on a scale so large that the Federal Reserve System is almost trivial. None of us yet have come to grips with the fact that all economics taught by Samuelson and others is in fact nation-state economics involving nation-state models. And we are now entering a world model. And the result is that you see every night flows of money, you see changes in value, you see worldwide competitions. In terms of labor, it means that the price of labor on the planet will be set in South China, and that is a change so extraordinary that it will affect all of us very deeply. If you want your children to have the highest standard of living with the highest take-home pay, with the highest quality of life and the greatest range of choices, then they are going to have to be competitive with people from across the whole planet. It's no longer Ohio competing with Indiana, it's now Americans competing with Germans and Chinese, and that's a level of competition we have not faced in our lifetime. The third large fact that we face is that the welfare state has failed. Now, I just want to assert this as an objective fact, and as a historian, I want to suggest to you that you cannot maintain civilization with 12-year-olds having babies, 15-year-olds killing each other, 17-year-olds dying of AIDS, and 18-year-olds getting diplomas they can't read. And you can't talk about quality or profound knowledge in a system in which being in a teenage gang, raping somebody, and dealing in drugs may be the most probable patterns or norms. And so we are faced, I think, not just with liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat, we're faced as Americans with a genuine crisis of our civilization. And the whole structure of delivery systems embodied in the welfare state has profoundly failed to create the environment for people to lead lives that sustain civilization. The last fact we face in America is that the bond of trust and accountability and responsibility between elected officials and the voters has now weakened to a point where probably the cynicism and anger and alienation are greater than they have been at any point since the American Revolution. Part of this is the economic pain of the world market. Part of it is the chaos and disruptiveness of the third wave. Part of it is the anger over the failure of the welfare state and the sense of money being wasted and the rising sense of insecurity against crime. But the totality of it is, in fact, a crisis of our civilization that in itself is very destabilizing. You cannot maintain honest self-government in a society where people profoundly distrust everyone to whom they loan power. And so we are going to have to rethink, in the context of the information age and in the context of the world market, what it's like to have effective self-government. Now, as we try to develop answers to this, and I can't frankly deal with that in any great detail today, I teach a course called Renewing American Civilization, which takes 20 hours to try to outline thinking about the answers. And I would argue, as somebody who's been elected 8 times and who is the second-ranking Republican in the House, that the number one problem in Washington today is not money, it's not courage, it's intellectual. We do not have an intellectual framework today for replacing the welfare state and designing a 21st century information age America capable of competing in the world market and capable of renewing American civilization. And so trying to solve the intellectual framework and trying to create the intellectual structure is, I think, the most important political challenge to our civilization today. In the course Renewing American Civilization, we spend 20 hours looking at this, and it's available by calling an 800 number. It's available first on National Empowerment Television, which is a new satellite channel. We show it every Wednesday from 1 to 3 Eastern Time. Second, it's available in audio and videotape by calling 1-800-2RENEW, T-O-R-E-N-E-W. Third, I want to just say we're going to reteach it in January, and I'd be very interested in any ideas, any suggestions, any improvements you'd like to offer. We talk in the course about 5 pillars of American civilization. Personal strength, the spirit of invention and discovery, entrepreneurial free enterprise, Dr. Deming's concepts of profound knowledge, and the lessons of American history. I'm not going to go into the other 4, but let me briefly talk about Dr. Deming and why we think that one of the 5 things people ought to look at in trying to renew American civilization is profound knowledge. I think that Dr. Deming, who at least in my reading of his work, and I spent, I guess, somewhere between 50 and 60 hours in a personal one-on-one tutorial with him, and as was mentioned earlier, my wife Marianne, in addition to that, also went and took the 4-day course and stayed for an additional 5th day for CEOs. And we worked very hard with Barbara Lawton and others to try to understand what is this all about. I was turned on at a couple levels. One is by a long-range planner named Owen Roberts in Tampa, Florida, who told me about 8 years ago I needed to read Out of the Crisis. Then I went and took a 3-day senior management review that Milliken Industries does, where every year they take their top 270 managers off, and for 3 days they review where the company's at. And they allowed me to come to see how they do it. And they spent almost half that time re-immersing themselves in the concepts of quality and looking at how to maintain a focus on quality. I was so profoundly impressed with the level to which they had tried to change their culture as a corporation that I decided I had to know more. So we called Dr. Deming and began the process of working with him. I would make just the following general observations, and I don't claim to be in any way an expert or a master. I'm simply somebody who has tried to get a general sense of what he was trying to accomplish. First, I think that his ideas are much more profoundly American than people normally tend to understand. If you listen to him for a long enough time and you ask him how he arrived at certain ideas or where they came from or what the context of them was, again and again you went back to Wyoming at the turn of the century and you went back to lessons he'd learned in the 20s and 30s working with people at AT&T and elsewhere. And it was a set of assumptions about individual honesty, individual responsibility, individual accountability that was imbued in an almost mythic, romantic sense of American virtues from that era. And I think in that sense that to try to understand him outside the context of his generation and his times is to shrink the level of understanding. Second, I believe that much of what he outlined was a combination of, frankly, just good common sense, shifting the focus outwards in a sense that Drucker describes to the customer and to the marketplace and to the opportunity, rather than having it focused inward on yourself and your own company. And frankly, encouraging people to see beyond themselves. That is, to create a sense of a larger awareness, almost what you might call enlightened citizenship. I was struck in working with him and in spending several years trying to solve the problem, and on several occasions we brought him to the Capitol and he met with House members, and one of them, Jim Nussel of Iowa, said to me it was one of the most exciting mornings of his life to be able to spend several hours asking Dr. Deming questions. We had, I guess the most striking point is, at one point one of the members said, why do we have to learn this? And Dr. Deming said, you don't. And stopped, and the whole room got very silent. And he said, failure is a perfectly reasonable alternative. And that sort of got people's attention. Now, I came away with the second thought. In addition to the notion that Dr. Deming himself and his basic core beliefs were profoundly American in their context, I also believe that he suffered from what C.P. Snow described as the two cultures. Some of you may be familiar with the Reith lectures on BBC in 1959, where C.P. Snow, who was a physicist who was also active in politics and wrote novels, tried to explain what he saw as an emerging crisis in Western civilization. He said there are two cultures now. There's a culture of math and science, and there's a culture of art and literature. And the people who do math and science almost never talk with the people who do art and literature. The result is that those who know are almost totally inarticulate, and those who are articulate are almost totally ignorant. Now, some of you are applauding that. It's a wonderful line. Now, the way I used to describe it is, if you are clever enough to be on Phil Donahue, you almost certainly don't know what you're talking about. And if you know what you're talking about, you almost certainly can't say it in a manner which will get you invited to Phil Donahue. Now, my problem is twofold, and then there are very different problems. But I want to share them with you because I really came here today to sort of dump on you my problems and then leave feeling much better and hope that all of you come up with a solution. Because this is not my problem. I am only an elected official, and I would simply suggest to you, if we had challenged you last night after your third drink to simply write down your reaction to the term congressman, or your reaction to the term, elected politician, and just folded that and put it in your pocket. If I now said to you, before you expect me to have an answer, pull back out how you would describe me generically. I feel pretty cheerful in coming here today and saying I haven't got a clue. I think that meets the standard you've set for my particular profession. In fact, some of you are probably amazed that I even have the idea that there should be a question. Now, let me tell you what the two problems are that I'm faced with. The first is that profound knowledge is a systemic approach to establishing a culture which has to be seen at the cultural level rather than at either the political or corporate level. And the best of profound knowledge ought to be translatable so that in kindergarten and first grade, if you think of the McGuffey readers of the 19th century, the McGuffey readers of the 21st century, which may well be programs on a laptop, are in fact, or they may just be available by entering a central system, ought to in fact include a sequence of learnings that can be described at the most simple and human levels. And so you've got to take all of Deming's complex and often difficult to understand language. You've got to think through, what does it really mean for normal people at a systems level? And then we've got to reduce it to behaviors which are learnable by normal people. And then it's got to become a standard for the human race. Now that's hard. By itself, that is as profound a challenge as the human race will face in the next half century. There is a second part of it, though. And I, by the way, need the first one because I do television. So, I did Brinkley yesterday, I did the Today Show this morning. If you went back and measured, the average length of time I was allowed to speak was probably 22 seconds. That's literally the amount of time you can speak before they break in because they get impatient and they worry that the show is getting too boring. So you've got to get down to learnable things that you can actually teach within the context of the civilization you're trying to teach. The second problem you've got is to vision or envision how we would operate. I wrote down the following list. How would America operate? How would government operate? How would communities operate? How would a person operate in a world in which profound knowledge was normal and no longer profound? It had in fact become common sense. And that's what profound knowledge. In a healthy civilization, profound knowledge would be common sense by definition. If it is profound knowledge and you want it out there for normal people, it is in essence the common sense of the information age world market America. So what then would we look like? How would we behave? How would campaigns be run? How would people respond? What would government structures be like? Well, how would learning occur? And I never talk about education because that's a second wave industrial concept. I talk about learning. How would learning occur? And why? How would we deal with health? And I never talk about health care because that's already a half step too far into the equation. I'm more worried about your health than I am about your health care. If I can keep you healthy, you need remarkably little health care. So one way to lower the cost of health care is to not need it. So you've got to look at these kind of walking your way through very profound questions. I would argue that the model we're looking for is in some ways a little bit like Gandhi inventing the movement in India for civil disobedience, or like Martin Luther rebelling around 1519, or Martin Luther King's efforts in civil rights, or in what is an almost never studied but remarkably profound moment in British history, Wesley and the rise of the Methodist movement. You can make a very powerful argument that if you look at Britain in 1700 and you look at Britain in 1792, that the largest single reason that the French Revolution did not occur in Britain was the Wesleyan movement and its impact on improving the lives of the poor by a privatized spiritual movement which literally lowered the drinking rate, lowered the alcoholism rate, reestablished the structure of family, and dramatically improved the lives of people who were living in poverty for almost all of the British Isles. Now, if you were to look at those movements, in a sense, each of them had certain characteristics. They were universal. They applied to all human beings. They were essentially moral, more than political. They involved changes that began with individuals and then spread through the entire civilization. Wilberforce, who led the fight against slavery, was a profoundly committed Methodist. And it was the Wesleyan movement's impact on the British Parliament which ultimately led to the abolition of slavery, which was a political action. But you can't explain the abolition of slavery without looking at the Wesleyan movement. So I'm suggesting to you that in a very deep sense, that Deming is above everything about a moral statement about the nature of life, the ways in which humans relate to each other, and the ends towards which humans should strive. And it is by trying to rethink at the most profound levels the profound knowledge, and then turning it into common language about common sense, that we can in fact have the greatest long-term impact. Just a couple of more suggestions for you to think about, and then I'm going to toss it open to questions or comments. I would like to recommend to those of you who are interested that you set up participatory task forces using cyberspace and electronics, and that you try to both think about interfacing with politicians in their government role, but also with politicians in their civic role. I did a seminar last weekend for the American Legislative Exchange Council on the role of the legislative leader in the 21st century. And I made the following point, that in a free society, a political leader has 4 jobs. And we tend to measure them exactly backwards. The most important job of a political leader is to describe vision and set an agenda and maintain a focus. It is to preach, to use what Theodore Roosevelt called the bully pulpit. It's what Reagan understood best, it's what Bush understood not at all. And the result was that as good as Bush was in some ways, he literally couldn't communicate with the country, and there was a psychic desperation by 1992 that had nothing to do with the economy and everything to do with the absence of somebody at the podium. The second job is to be the symbolic leader, to show up. I mean, had we been able, and we failed frankly, but had we been able to get Bush and Reagan to identify with Deming, by the simple act of publicly having lunch with him and 20 people who are using what he was doing. And to do that routinely, to begin to create a pattern, an openness, so that you symbolically reinforce this matters because the leader of our community is paying attention to it. You change everything. I mean, I'll give you a minor example. The President of the United States ought to have breakfast or lunch once a week with 20 successful blacks about 30 years of age who have risen from poverty. And every week they ought to meet him, listen to him for an hour, and then take him out to the Rose Garden and let the press talk, so that we begin to send the message to every 9-year-old black that someday you could have lunch with the President of the United States, because staying in school, doing your homework, studying, learning how to work, learning how to save does pay off, and it's you who could be there, because here are people that look like you who are right there on your television. Now, by the simple act of allocating 1 hour a week, the President would send a signal over and over every week into the community, and would then empower 20 missionaries to go back home and be important, because they could now go to every church and every school in their community and say, "Hi, I was at the White House last week having lunch with the President." So the symbolic power of a leader is extraordinary. The third level is to gather resources other than government. To be able to reach out to people and say, together, remember, in a free society, the government is by definition never the center of resources. In a socialist or totalitarian society, a government is the center of resources. But in a free society, even at its peak, the federal government in peacetime has never been above 24% of GNP, which meant that 76% were at the state, local, or private sector levels. And in America, the totality of all governments has never been above 45%. So we've always had over half the money, and the truth is, as all of you know, you can shift human resources and money faster in the private sector than you can in government by several orders of magnitude. So if you're a clever leader, you want to reach out to people who can move, not to people who can write reports. Because you're trying to affect the real behavior, not trying to affect the bureaucracy. The last job of a leader, and the least important, is the manager of the bureaucracy. Now, there's a famous story about Reagan re-meeting the head of HUD. And people thought it was a sign that Reagan didn't know what he was doing, because he walked around a room shaking hands with mayors, and he shook the hand with the Secretary of HUD and thought he was a mayor. The fact was, Reagan always knew that if they lost a cabinet officer, that Jim Baker would find a new one, that he would get him appointed, and that he'd be okay. And Reagan knew that as a man who was already in his late 60s, that he only had three jobs: reestablish the morale of the American people, cut the tax rates to re-encourage the entrepreneurial free enterprise system, and build up the military to defeat the Soviet Empire. And he figured if at the end of his career he'd had the longest period of peacetime economic expansion, the Soviet Empire had collapsed, and Americans were proud about being American again, that whoever had been secretaries of second-order cabinet jobs would have done fine. But he couldn't do both. And it's a very important thing for all of you to think about. We tend to measure mayors, county commissions, governors, and presidents by how well they manage a bureaucracy, when in fact their primary job is to orient the community, create a dialogue, serve symbolically to focus the community and to reinforce the community, and then gather the community up to do something. And by the way, also run the government so it's not too scandalous and it doesn't waste too much money and it's not too stupid. But when you get a president, as we did with Carter and we did again with Bush, who focuses first on managing the bureaucracy, you guarantee the disintegration of the system, because they're not doing their first three jobs. So my point to you would be twofold. We need a participatory task force. And by participatory, I mean you want to make it open to anybody in America who has an interest in learning, which says, A, what is the common knowledge that should be commonly available that grows out of profound knowledge that everybody should have? And B, what should elected officials know about the 4 layers of their job, which they should change as a consequence of what we're thinking about? And I think, frankly, we could find, between 7 and a dozen members of the House who would be willing to work as part of a participatory task force trying to understand those 2 questions, and then trying to actually apply them to what we're doing. I also think that we could get the Congressional Institute to help work on that. And I will mention 2 last things. I work with a foundation called the Progress and Freedom Foundation. It's doing a conference in Atlanta in August called Cyberspace and the American Dream. We deliberately talk about cyberspace rather than information superhighway, because there is no information superhighway. Information superhighway is a second wave industrial term designed to make government planners feel better. Cyberspace is a ubiquitous, pervasive, low-cost, and democratic institution available to anybody who can get access to it. I will drive Al Gore's planners crazy because, in fact, people will invent it faster than they can plan it, and it will just go out and become. And so we got to think to ourselves, in a true information revolution, where everybody has access to information, how are we going to operate? And the Progress and Freedom Foundation is trying to answer that question. Lastly, I do a TV show every Tuesday night on National Empowerment Television called The Progress Report. I would be very interested, any of you who have progress to report, if you're in Washington. We pay no money, we have no travel money, but if you're interested in showing up, it's a call-in show, and I usually spend 5 minutes explaining what has happened in Washington that week, and then we spend about 15 minutes giving you a shot at explaining what you're doing that's good, and then we take questions for the rest of the show and let people ask you interesting questions. So if you have progress to report and you're going to be in Washington on a Tuesday, if you'll contact Jeff Eisenach at the Progress and Freedom Foundation, it's at 10 o'clock Tuesday night. We'd love to put you on it. It's on National Empowerment TV, which has access to about 25 million homes between satellite receivers and cable. And my guess personally is that our audience is somewhere between 50 and 75,000 people. And it's fun. It's also a good chance for me to get educated by listening to smart people. So that's what we're trying to do to raise the right questions. And now if I could, I think I still have about 25 minutes, let me toss it wide open and take questions, comments, whatever. Is that fair enough? Do you now take charge again?
If you would like to make a comment or have a question for Congressman Gingrich, please come to the microphone in the aisles, and when acknowledged by either Newt or myself, please state your name, your company before asking your question.
Okay, I'll just do it. Yes, ma'am.
This is on. My name is Laura Jokic. I'm with EDS. And my question is, you mentioned the lack of an intellectual framework. Could you expand on that, please? Do you remember when you were talking about that? It was somewhere between the third and fourth fact about the failing welfare state and the...
Sure. I'll give you an example. I believe that we essentially have today a nation-state model of economics. We have an industrial era second wave model of how the world works, and we have a Weberian bureaucratic model of how government functions. All three are now wrong. So what do you replace them with? Because you got to replace them. You can't just say, boy, that's wrong, let's not do anything. I'll give you just one or two quick examples. I believe incentives matter. This is, and I'll give you a simple test, by the way, so you understand how deep this goes. Let me ask first of all, how many of you have been in Germany? Raise your hand if you've been in Germany. Okay, almost half the audience. So you can validate what I'm going to say. The reason bureaucracy profoundly doesn't work in America, more than any other society on the planet, goes to the core of American civilization and why people came to America and what people learned for over 200 years about being American. In Germany, on the Autobahn, if you're outside of a congested area, there's no speed limit. Many of you may have had the experience that I've had of, you rent a car, you're doing 100 miles an hour, you feel really pumped, and a Mercedes goes by at 160, and you want to pull your car off to the side of the road and just quit. I mean, you've lost any sense of, if tomorrow morning the Bundestag adopted a 100-kilometer or 62-mile-an-hour speed limit, virtually every German would obey it until the next election, at which point they would massacre the current generation of politicians and they would elect the no speed limit party. Now, without offending any of you, I want to suggest to you that the American cultural response to the challenge of speed limits has been profoundly different. For most Americans, a speed limit is a benchmark of opportunity. Now, I'll just give you the asset. I mean, I'm leading up to this is as profound as anything Deming talks about. This goes to the core of being American. Now, I'll give you a simple example. How many of you in the last week might have gone faster than the posted number? I mean, raise your hand for a second. Now, raise your hand, look around the room. Now, why is this important? Because a Weberian bureaucratic model is a rule-ridden regulatory model. Now, what we just proved in this room is that virtually every middle-class American will automatically break the rules. And if you pass petty regulations, people will say, first of all, how do I get around it? And second, if I can't get around it, what are the odds they'll catch me? And third, if they catch me, what are the odds there's a sanction that matters? So when you talk about, for example, designing a national health system which is dominated by a federal bureaucracy, you know you've increased the employment for lawyers and counselors and consultants unbelievably, because the first act of every American will be to figure out how to get around it. Now, then you take education. Why does education fail? By any objective standard, central education in America in the central city schools is a disaster. It is one of the most destructive public services on the planet. We spend thousands of dollars. In Jersey City, Brett Schundler, the most innovative mayor in the country, Schundler goes out on campaigns. He says, in Jersey City, we spend $9,200 per child. 27% of them pass the minimum standard. For $9,200, you could send them to Ivy League prep schools. Now, why do they fail? They fail because they are bureaucratic structures dominated by regulations with tenured employees which try to say to poor children, here is a middle-class set of values that we will give you paper rewards for achieving. Now, let me give you an example of a framework. We started out about 6 years ago and said, what works in America? Incentives work in America. Now, I know this is profoundly un-Deming, but I'm going to start talking about where we're at, and then I'm going to throw it open for you all to figure out better solutions. So we went into the poorest neighborhoods. What do kids see on television? Baseball players striking for $1 million salaries. Basketball players getting $1 million contracts. So this poor kid sits there and says, gee, what kind of future do I have? Well, you can be a pimp, prostitute, drug dealer, armed robber. Nobody communicates that reading is of any value. And children in poor neighborhoods have very short time horizons. So we developed a program called Earning by Learning, and I'm stipulating so we don't have to fight over it. This is profoundly un-Deming. And I would argue only that as a transition to a more Deming-like world, this works. And that its one great virtue is it works. We go into these public housing projects and we say to poor kids, we'll pay you $2 for every book you read. Kids show up, I don't care how poor they are, I don't care what neighborhood they're in, I don't care if they have nobody there at home, no books in the house. They instantly understand the theoretical proposition. We've tried it in 17 states. The model is you use adult volunteers, you use the public library, you get free space from the housing project because you're keeping the kids busy in the summer. You take the kids to the public library. The only cash involved in the entire system is the money that goes to the kids. So you have a very low overhead, no infrastructure, non-bureaucratic model that is decentralized and entrepreneurial. The result is, everywhere it's been tried, kids learn how to read. Now, I would argue that ultimately you want to eliminate all of those requirements and get those kids to a healthy society in which they wouldn't need that incentive. But it works. I talked to an aerospace company. We're going to spend $30 billion to go into space. I said to them, if we put up $8 billion as an end goal and said, if you put a station in space, here's $8 billion cash. No meetings with NASA, no planning sessions, no long committee meetings, no federal reports. If it works, here's the money. How many companies would try to do it for $8 billion? They said 5. So we're going to spend $30 billion to do it through a federal bureaucracy, which will spend $22 billion on studies in order to get the $8 billion a space station, because we've lost the model which led Lindbergh to cross the Atlantic. He got $25,000 landing in Paris. Now, and it wasn't the money as cash. It was the sense that this mattered, that this was a big deal. What I'm suggesting to all of you is that we don't have today a structure for breaking out. I talked last night with somebody who's going to talk to you all later on about a company which has now replaced all of its incentive programs with a totally different approach. I think that may well be part of the future. But then you've got to get down to those kids. And I would argue you could do that in school, but then you'd have to say to yourself, why is it we don't pay any of the learners in school, we only pay the teacher? If we had profit sharing for first grade, I mean, I'm just asking you. We as a society are prepared to pay these kids. You know, we say teaching 30 kids in Jersey City is worth $276,000. We currently spend all of it on red tape, bureaucracy, and stupid regulations. What if we went into a room with the kids and their parents and said, we have $276,000 for the 30 of you to learn. We'd like to set up a profit sharing program. If all of you learn how to read, we'll split the money. If half of you learn how to read, we'll split 135,000. That's whatever. I'm half serious, but I'm also trying to give you a framework that says we don't today have any kind of intellectual model that lets us get outside the bureaucracy. So your choices are, you can be a right-wing Republican like me and say bureaucracy fails, let's not pay it any money, or you can be a good liberal and say, well, bureaucracy fails, but at least it's trying, so let's give it the money, so at least when it fails, we'll feel guilt. We won't be guilt-ridden because we at least sent the check, and it's not our fault that it failed. And I'm saying, you got 6-year-old kids being ruined in this country because we have no imaginative ability to break out and say, what would save the kids? And so I'd start with that notion. Tell me the framework intellectually, and tell me, and this goes back to Deming's sense of profound knowledge, that you've got to have a prediction. What's your theory of what'll work? Why do you think it'll work? Wait, we go to Chicago, or we go, frankly, right here, or we go to Cleveland, or we go to Atlanta, we say, gee, PS 101 in the inner city failed last year. What's our theory of why it'll work this year? We don't have one. And we know last year 80% of the kids in PS 101 didn't get to their grade level in reading. Why do we think we'll do better this year? We don't have one. So what are we going to do in September? We're going to send all of these children into a school that we know failed last year. You talk about getting within some standard of performance? We do. They got to 80% failure last year. They'll get to 80% failure this year. They're tracking right along. And so I start with the notion, and Dr. Deming absolutely trapped me in it. Because it's basically just the essence of good science. What is your theoretical model, and what's your prediction, and why will it be different? And if you don't have a theoretical model and you don't have a prediction for why it'll be different, why do you think doing more of what's failing will change, except it'll be a more expensive failure? And so I start with, tell me the idea. Then I'll try to figure out the program. Yes, sir.
It seems to me that central to Dr. Deming's theories is cooperation as opposed to competition. Your particular industry is fraught with competition, liberal versus conservative, Republican versus Democrat. What are you doing to change that kind of environment?
Well, let me say, first of all, I think when you're in a fight between paradigms, it's very hard to change. Dr. Deming also was willing reluctantly to release people if they refused to learn his model. So I would start and say that Deming's belief in cooperation starts within a framework that says, if we've all agreed on what we're doing, and we've all agreed in the general direction we're going in, we ought to cooperate with each other. But that doesn't mean that there aren't circumstances where cooperation doesn't work. And it was probably useful to him to try to teach the Japanese after we won. I'm not sure he'd have gotten the same reception had he visited Japan in 1939 and said, gee, here's a better way to cooperate. They would have said, give up China, for example, give up Manchukuo. Don't think about in the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. I suspect at that point the Japanese militarists would have said, glad you visited, take a picture of Mount Fuji and go home. So I start with the notion, I'm very prepared to cooperate, but it depends on what you're trying to get done. And I think until you have a vision level shift in the nature of the system, you can't talk very well about cooperation if one half of the system is saying, let's cooperate and go do something that is profoundly destructive. And I'm not saying that on a partisan basis. I'm just saying all of you have to understand, politics is about power, and it's about deciding where you're going. Once you've made the decision where you're going, cooperation's very easy. It's the fight over the decision that's very hard. One of the places where I think profound knowledge can help is to shift the dialogue so that the debate is more of a dialogue and less of just yelling at each other. And one of the things that Dick Gephardt and I have done is established an Oxford-style debate, we've done 3 of them so far, as an effort to begin to move the House back towards more of a rational dialogue and less of just having attack sound bites. So I do think you can have a dialogue about the difference. But I think if one side, I'm going to use gibberish for a second. If one side is in a second wave, industrial era, bureaucratic, redistributionist, nation-state economy mode, and the other side is in a third wave, information age, world market, opportunity society mode, the odds are pretty clear that you have a profound disagreement here. This is not a problem of communications. This is a fundamental disagreement about the nature of reality. And there I think you've got to simply fight it out until one side or the other wins. And then once you've done that, I think you can have tremendous levels of cooperation, even though at the strategies and projects and tactics level you may disagree. But you can be cooperative in the broad general sense of defining where you're going. Yes, sir.
Representative Gingrich, it's nice to meet you. My name is Jay Howell. I'm from Seattle, Washington. I represent a Deming users group called the Eastside Quality Council. I think that I think that Deming has room for all of us, conservatives and liberals. I'm on the opposite side of the fence from you on many issues. I think that speed limits do have some usefulness, and I don't agree that the welfare state is dead unless you want to include the military-industrial complex, which it has mostly fed. However, the question I want to ask you today, as I got my brochure that you were going to speak, I turned on the television and saw you on NPR, where you get more than a 22-second soundbite, and you were describing your concerns or your opposition to the ban on assault weapons. And I just couldn't find where that was connected to anything that Deming would think about. I'm not speaking for him, and I'm here to listen to your ideas about what, the way you view your world. But could you help me understand how opposing a ban on assault weapons would be connected to anything that we call quality life in America, please?
Sure. I mean, I'll be glad to do that. I don't know that you'll necessarily buy the answer. But I'll be glad to tell you my rationale. First of all, I would just suggest to you that if you want to be honest about it, it's not a ban on assault weapons. If you go back to the vision level, to what degree, and again, I think we'd have a long debate, and I would discourage it, although I don't mind it. To what degree is the primary problem in violent crime in America the criminal, and to what degree is the primary problem in America the weapon? The O.J. Simpson trial is about to be is going to be about the death of two people who were killed with a knife. They weren't, in fact, killed with a gun. The 19 weapons that are supposed to be banned, none of them are on the list of the 10 weapons used most frequently in armed robberies. None of them, by the way, involve taking back the 1,300,000 weapons of their type currently available. And so you got to come to a question of what do you think works? I was in Israel, and everywhere you went on the weekend in Israel, you saw teenagers carrying automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons. They were military people on leave, required by law to carry their weapons while they're on leave. Went out on dates carrying a weapon. In Switzerland, every adult male up to 45 years of age must keep an army weapon at home because they mobilize the entire adult male population in a crisis. Now, in both countries, by the way, if you commit an act of murder or rape, they are ferocious in their penalties. They just don't tolerate it. And so I started with a very simple premise. I am willing to be as ruthless as necessary to keep violent people from doing it more than once. And all of our lessons historically are that if you are prepared to be very, very tough with violent criminals, you have a remarkable decline in the crime rate. And I regard virtually all the current PR about weapons as essentially that. It is illegal to carry a gun in Washington, D.C. It has one of the highest murder rates in the country. It's illegal. It is illegal to carry a gun in New York City. It has one of the highest murder rates in the country. It is legal to carry guns in Alaska. Dramatically lower murder rate. And in fact, my guess is Alaskans have more weapons per capita than D.C. does. But it's a totally different cultural environment. So I simply start from a premise. I think we ought to focus on the problem. I identify the problem with the criminal. I'm willing to take the criminal off the street. Another example, the very same bill that contains a gun ban, they took out a 10-year mandatory sentence for the possession of a firearm in the commission of a felony. Now, I'm prepared to lock up the felon for an additional 10 years and make it honest time. That is, you actually have to serve the 10 years. So I'm saying to you, you use a gun in the commission of a crime, you're gone for a very long time. They're saying, you try to buy one of these 10, we'll sure harass you, 19, we'll sure harass you. But by the way, if you use the gun in the commission of a crime, we won't lock you up for 10 years. I'll let you decide, and you can apply Deming's rules if you want to, as a theoretical proposition about America, which is more effective. Lastly, I would say to the gentleman, I didn't make a point about whether or not I obey the speed limit. I didn't say anything about it. I made the point that if you want to be honest about the civilization you're part of, the fact is this is the most independent, wide-open, opportunity-seeking civilization in history. The pursuit of happiness is at the core of this civilization, and the fact is 3/4 of the people who are in this room raised their hand. Now that's an objective fact, and I think it's useful to start with knowing who the civilization is for which you're trying to draw rules. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name's John Dahmer from Louisiana. My question is on health care. It's a twofold question. And you were mentioning that we should listen, learn, help, and lead. And in the health care issue, is that being done in reference to the people who may be involved with the problem in health care, and that is the doctors, the hospitals, the attorneys, and the insurance companies? And as a person at home, I don't seem to hear where they're all meeting together and talking about that problem. And secondly, part of that question would be, is it too late to just back up and freeze the cost of the system? Because if the system costs less, maybe everyone could afford it.
Well, let me say, first of all, I don't think you have much discussion at some levels because, for example, trial lawyers have a radically different vision of how life would operate than do most medical doctors. So you've got very real differences of how you approach the problems. Second, there's a core question about A, what is the problem, and B, whether government is the primary solution. Because you get 3 or 4 different problems. One is you want the lowest cost system of providing health care once somebody gets sick, so that everybody has access to it. The second is you want the most honest method of accounting for that system, so you know what people actually cost, and you're actually trying to get back from them what it costs to take care of them. Third, you ideally would like to design the system so that it minimizes the amount of health care you need. Now, we have had grow up over the last 70 years a system which focuses on acute illness but neglects preventive care. And all of its underlying biases are in that direction. We've also had, growing up out of World War II, a third-party payment system which frankly makes it relatively easy to inflate costs. Now, I'll give you just a simple example. My wife had a thyroid condition last year. She called 4 doctors to find out what it would cost to visit their office and get the test. None of them would tell her. Now, that's a disgrace. I mean, we ought to legally require that hospitals and doctors tell you their historic track record of costs and outcomes so you can have a real marketplace. And you'd find overnight prices were crashing. I talked to a hospital the other day, which has offered a 70% discount for its bed rates to a local managed care unit that promises to fill up its beds. Now, 70% less expensive than its normal price. So I would suggest to you there are a lot of ways to bring down the cost of health care, and there are a lot of ways to shift resources into preventive care, starting with some kind of voucher for every woman who gets pregnant, so you have adequate prenatal care, so you minimize the neonatal cost of babies who are born early. Now that by itself will save literally hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. I just think there are steps you can take that are dramatically different. I have been co-chair with Bob Michael of the Republican Task Force on Health since July of 1991 in the House. We do think it's possible to write a much more decentralized, technically sophisticated and market-oriented bill than you've seen out of the Clinton administration. I don't know what will happen on it this year. It's all sort of a muddle right now. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Sherry Marshall, and I work for General Motors in Pontiac, Michigan. And my question is, what is the aim of the system of government in the United States, and how was that aim developed?
The aim is established in the Constitution, to provide for the common defense and provide for the common welfare, and to establish justice. I'll let you decide. It's developed through a very chaotic and complex process involving elections at lots of levels and involving a dialogue that is 365 days a year, all year round, and has been for over 200 years. And it's a mess. Although I would argue it is not profoundly a mess. Let me just for a minute defend the American system. I was talking with George Will about this yesterday. When I talk to young people about being involved in politics, one of my pitches to them is, look at Bosnia, look at Rwanda, look at Haiti, then look at your local evening news about crime and understand that those are what happens when civilizations break down. Churchill once said that democracy is the worst of all forms of government except all the others. And there's a lot to be said for this. I'm not a utopian. I do not believe that people are perfectible, and I don't believe that we're likely to invent a system of government which works perfectly. I believe that humans are remarkably weak, and that in fact humans basically have some propensity towards evil, and that you at best are likely to get a government which does relatively little damage. And that if you try for a lot more than that, you pretty rapidly move into a totalitarian system. Now, having said that, notice how the Founding Fathers designed our government. Their primary interest was to avoid tyranny. Their technique was to establish a system in which they dramatically decentralized power. First of all, they argued that you're endowed by your Creator with certain unalienable rights, so that you and God have the power, you loan it to the state. This is the only civilization in the world where power starts with the individual, doesn't start with government. You loan government, power. You loan it first to the local governments, state and local governments, under Article 10, which reserves to the people and the governments all other powers except those expressly given to the federal government. Then you have all sorts of rights that are protected, Fifth Amendment being an example, right of free speech. Then you look at the federal system. The Founding Fathers said further, let's divide power. So you have a Supreme Court appointed for life. You have a Senate elected every 6 years, only a third elected any 2-year term, and they represent the states. You have members of the House elected every 2 years, and they represent persons. And then you have the President elected every 4 years to represent everybody. Now, that is such a divided, convoluted system that the only way to understand it is to appreciate that the Founding Fathers thought of themselves as engineers who were consciously trying to design a machine so inefficient that no dictator could make it to work. The corollary is that volunteers can barely get it to work voluntarily. Now, if you will accept that standard, I would argue that overall it has worked reasonably well for 250 years. It absorbed all the changes of the second wave industrial revolution. Remember, it is written originally by first wave agricultural citizens reflecting on the experiences of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Anglo-Saxon tradition, and the Roman Republic. And it is out of those models that they wrote the Constitution and they wrote the Federalist Papers. It then has absorbed all of the industrial era second wave changes. The test we're now faced with is, can we rise to the challenge of absorbing the third wave world market challenges and creating a working model for the 21st century? And all I would suggest to you is that as frustrating as it is, as difficult as it is remarkably cheaper in human terms than the KGB or the Gestapo or the kind of brutality you're seeing in Rwanda and Bosnia and Haiti. I know that's a minimalist defense, but I would suggest to you as mature adults, it may well be that minimums beat utopian maximums, and that in fact the system just needs your energy and your creativity for another generation. Two last quick questions. The gentleman back there and then you. Yes, sir.
My name is Lee Ferguson. I'm an independent consultant from San Francisco. I'd like to ask you a favor, Congressman Gingrich, and then I'd like to ask you to restate something that you stated before. The favor is, I'd like for you to read the scientific research that's presented by Alfie Cohen in his book, Punished by Rewards. And that's in reference to paying children to read. Then could you state the 5 categories that you advance in your course, in which profound knowledge is one of those 5? And could you give us a couple of sentences of each one so that we have a little capsule
Sure.
of the concepts that you're advocating in that course?
Yeah, very briefly. Personal strength, the notion that if you are not personally capable, for example, of getting up and going to work, of personally being responsible for your own life, you can't sustain freedom, you can't sustain civilization. So you have to have a fairly high level of personal strength to sustain a free society. It's not just courage in the battlefield, but it's the whole notion of the work ethic, the whole notion of people who are willing to be held accountable for their own lives. And who are therefore also willing to say to elected officials, we want to hold you accountable just as we hold ourselves accountable. Second is the entrepreneurial free enterprise, not just in the business sense, but in the sense of cutting through the red tape, getting the job done. I cite in the course Jack Horner's description in his book T-Rex on how they used a variety of innovative steps in order to excavate a Tyrannosaurus Rex for $50,000 when probably a bureaucracy would have done it for about $400,000. We recently had a young man on our TV program, The Progress Report, who has developed a program for going to Mars, which he thinks you can do for about $20 billion, which is 5% of the cost of the NASA study 5 years ago because they wanted 400 billion. He thinks you can do it by 2003. They thought you could do it by 2020. Just again, breaking through the red tape. The Wright brothers would be another example. Thomas Edison. The spirit of invention and discovery. And this is not just technology, but it's the attitude that gets up every morning and says, gee, I wonder what I'll learn about the world today. I wonder what I can do better. It's everything from Post-it notes to Thomas Edison, to Benjamin Franklin discovering electricity, to the creation of the lightning rod. And in many ways, it's not so much science. Science is the codification later of the phenomena you discover. But it's very often just gone out and breaking through, learning new things. Fourth is profound knowledge in the Deming model, and by that I mean trying to understand a system of principles which allows you to organize your life and the life of people with whom you work and associate to achieve much greater levels of productivity than you would achieve normally. And also to define that productivity in ways that are much more effective in the marketplace. And then finally, the lessons of American history, the notion that if this has been the most successful civilization in history at integrating and empowering and liberating people, and I would argue that you cannot make a reasonable argument that any other society has ever brought together as many people from as many different backgrounds and empowered them to pursue happiness on the scale of American civilization. That if that's true, and I would just cite Colin Powell and John Shalikashvili as two examples, that no other society I know of in history would have brought in a first-generation West Indian immigrant or an Eastern European immigrant in his own right and moved them to be in charge of their entire military structure in one lifetime and do it back to back. That this has been a remarkable civilization. Then maybe when you're looking for solutions, you should start by looking to America. And you should ask, what's worked in America? Why is it that America has been such a remarkable society, and what should we learn from the lessons of American history? That's sort of a simple sketch of it. Yes, sir, the last question.
Good morning, Congressman. My name is Tommy Benn. I'm from Portsmouth, Virginia. I'm the chairman of the school board in Portsmouth. It's a 17,000 pupil inner city school system fraught with what you talked about. I've been trying for 5 years to to make people understand my understanding of profound knowledge. The school board, the administration, the teachers, the customers. Most people don't want to hear it. They don't understand it. They certainly don't want to take the time understanding profound knowledge and its meaning and what it can do for us. Do you have any suggestions for me in all education in the United States?
Well, I think you're faced with a very difficult problem. I'm going to tell you what I honestly believe, but it's probably not very helpful, okay? I believe that bureaucratic, centralized education is at a dead end. And I don't think you can improve it dramatically. I think that it's at a dead end because it is out of sync with the information age. I think it's a dead end because it's bureaucratic rather than entrepreneurial. And I think it's at a dead end because it focuses on the teacher rather than the learner. I'm not suggesting you give up your position, but if you were asking me how I would go about changing it, I would go back home and I would, remember I listed 4 layers. The least important is the bureaucracy you run. I would take Drucker's, The Effective Executive, which is the best single book on self-management I've ever read. And I would read that and I'd apply it to your problem. And I start with this question. Why is it that your city is spending the money it's spending? And I'd really spend some time on the vision level. And I go out to people and say to them, why are we doing this? What's the point? And you'll discover if you ask them long enough that the point has nothing to do with buildings, teachers, curriculums. The point has to do with what I call 2 waves of immigrants that every society has. We have geographic immigrants. They're called foreigners. And we know they have to learn how to be American because otherwise, how are they going to figure it out? But there's a temporal immigrant called a child. And they've got to learn too. And the whole purpose behind the original establishment of public learning, not public education, but public learning, was the notion that you could not have a free society unless every citizen learned how to be a citizen. And to do that, they had to both learn skills, reading, writing, math, geography, whatever, and they had to learn substance. They had to learn this is George Washington. This is a constitution. This is an election. And unless they learn both sets of information, They couldn't actually be empowered to be a citizen. And so we were cheating them and we were cheating the society. The 19th century industrial answer to that, this is not the answer of the Founding Fathers. In the 1840s, long after Jefferson had died, we invented the Massachusetts public school system, which was the first universal public school system. Didn't exist till then. I would argue that that was an industrial era second wave system. And what I would suggest if I were you is don't try to take on the system. Let it sit there. I mean, improve it as much as you can, but don't worry about it. It's basically gone. Instead, what I would do is I'd go back out, once you got people to agree to a shared vision, which is we want these children to have the maximum skills and the maximum knowledge so they can lead the best possible lives with the greatest possible economic return, doing the widest range of things so they can pursue happiness as they describe it, because they've got to define it themselves, so that they can be full citizens in a truly free society in which they can live out both their civic responsibilities and pursue their civic opportunities. I'm making this up, but it gives you a flavor. Listen, notice, everything I just said is about them. Nothing about their teachers, nothing about the curriculum, nothing about the average daily attendance, nothing about all the Mickey Mouse rules. It's about them. And then I'd say, could we establish 5 or 10 experiments that are totally learner-focused? And I'll give you a couple nutty ones. Give 4-year-olds PCs, laptops rather, with audio tapes that show them how to use it, and tell them that as soon as they learn how to read and write, they get $10,000. Now again, I understand I understand Deming's model about not rewarding people. I would suggest to you, everybody assumes people will get paid. I mean, nobody has yet said what we ought to do is have such profound knowledge we give up our salaries. I doubt if many of the consultants here show up and say, please don't give me a check. So we're willing to get paid. So I'm willing to say, you could even make it a group exercise. As soon as all 10 of you can read, we'll give all 10 of you $10,000 each, so that there's no private incentive for individuals. But notice what you've now done. You begin to place back in the learner the incentive. You begin to place back in the learner the economic reward. Now, they may decide to hire somebody to teach them. That might be the most efficient way for them to get the 10 grand. But I'm trying to give you a sense of how, I mean, unless we break totally outside this. Second example, every class ought to be audio taped. If you're going to drive, this is not a problem for you because you're at the beach. But I'm in Atlanta. We got a lot of kids that want to drive to the beach. I want those kids to be able to listen to the chemistry lecture on the way to the beach. Now you say to me, gee, that's dumb. They're going to listen to something. I'd rather have them listen to chemistry lectures than rap music. I'd rather define for them what we want to achieve. And I'll leave you one last example. I recently had my college interns in, and I was talking about how do you break out of the current model. And I said, what if we said to every, and I want to give you 2 last examples. What if we said to every entering high school freshman, you have 4 years to get through. And we as a community are going to pay you, we'll pay $5,000, I don't know what your total cost, state, federal, and local is of your school system, we'll pay $5,000 a student for 4 years. But for every year you get done early and meet your high school graduation requirements, we'll give you 80% of that year's money as a scholarship. So you get done in 3 years, here's $4 grand, automatically. You go to the school of your choice. Votech, high college, we don't care. You get done in 2 years, here's $8,000. I said to him, how many of you would have gotten done in 3 years? Every single college intern said they would have. I said, how many of you would have gotten done in 2 years? Half of them raised their hand. They basically stayed in high school because it was social time. So they wasted 2 years of their life, hung out on Friday nights looking for something to do, and studied about a third of the speed they were capable of. Because it's impossible currently to toughen high school up enough to make it competitive with German and Japanese high schools. And you couldn't do it. You couldn't stand the public rebellion if you tried to do it. So I'm just suggesting to you there's another angle. Last example. We should give $0 for unemployment compensation unless you're learning something. This idea of giving people 26 weeks of money to go deer hunting while they wait for their factory to come out of a cyclical recession is absolutely nonsense in the world market. You want to say to people, if we give you money, you'd better either be working or you better be learning. But we don't have the resources as a society to waste half a year of your life at a time with our subsidy. And we need for you to be a lot better educated if your factory's closed permanently. And so we don't want you to go through, a year of extended unemployment, and then you show up having learned nothing, having done no work. And then you say to me, gee, what should I do now? What you should have done is taken the year we were subsidizing you and learned something. And I'd come back to you and say, you show me a school district that is a learning district, that says to people from birth to death, give us a call, we want you to learn. And then makes available in a user-friendly manner, using cyberspace and electronics, a totality of learning. And I think you'll see an explosion of people trying to learn in this country. But if you say to them, show up at 10 o'clock for a 1-hour course at the teacher's convenience to be bored, while the teacher who's half prepared tries to tell you about something they don't fully understand, which may or may not ever help you get a job, they say, I don't think so, I'd rather watch Oprah. And that's the problem. I don't know if that helped you at all, but I appreciate you giving me a shot at it. Thank you all very, very much.